Welcome back to the Chad Hasty Show on News Talk 95.1 FM and 790 AM KFYO. Scott Braddock, editor of Quorum Report.
I'm in Houston this morning, about to head back to Austin. At least once every year I make the trip to Houston for the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo.
Very nice.
More trips than that to Houston, but always at least one for the rodeo. And, of course, last night my 17-year-old daughter had to see the Panic at the Disco show. I'm telling you, if you're a 17-year-old girl, it was the place to be.
At the rodeo, who knew?
Well, yes, and I'm old enough to remember, in working in radio in Houston years ago when it was controversial that they had, artists who were not country artists, and now of course they've got rap and rock and everything.
A little flavor for everybody.
Night, everything. Oh, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Scott,
I love the rodeo.
It was good to see you last week in Austin, and good to have you on the program today. I guess we'll start off with the Secretary of State in this list that went out. Obviously, I talked about it with the governor, and the governor blaming last week said that the Secretary of State was given a flawed list by Texas DPS. After that, where are we in this whole process? Because now it's up to the full Senate, right, to vote on his nomination.
Yeah, as the governor was on the air with you the very same day, the Texas Senate Nominations Committee voted along party lines, all the Republicans voting yes, all the Democrats voting no, to advance this nomination of Whitley. And, of course, Abbott telling you that, look, the problem here was, or at least that it originated with, the Department of Public Safety, and he called out the director of DPS, Steve McGraw, by name. The quote on your show was, so part of the fault goes to Steve McGraw, the director of DPS, for causing the error in the first place. The Democrats in the Senate seem to be holding firm on this, and as you know, they do have the votes to block this Secretary of State nominee, and of course Governor Abbott would have to come up with somebody else after the session is over if they do block it. It takes 2/3 of senators, and right now there are enough Democrats to deny the 2/3. So we'll see where this goes. It's interesting. I saw this and you and I had kind of originally thought, well, he's sort of throwing the DPS director under the bus, the governor is, but I kind of think in looking at all this that it's more of sort of a political human shield kind of situation. That's what I tweeted out.
Right.
Looking at the law, the fact is that the Secretary of State is subject to Senate confirmation, and the DPS director simply is not. So the DPS director doesn't get the same kind of scrutiny from the Senate, from the Senate, and the Democrats basically can't do anything about the DPS director. So if he's the one to blame, then there would be no reason for the Democrats to block Whitley, right? But I don't think that the Democrats are buying that just yet.
Well, and that's my question is, I think a lot of people were surprised, one, of the vote on Thursday morning before my show or right during the show.
Yeah.
And the lieutenant governor, I had him on right before the governor, and the lieutenant governor had said, yeah, I think the vote's going to be along party lines. That's what we're looking at. I don't know if he knew about this bomb that the governor sort of dropped on my show, because the governor afterwards said, "Well, we're in talks. This thing may not be done just yet." Do you think that's just the governor talking and saying what we're not ready to throw in the towel just yet, or do you think there is some discussion going on behind the scenes?
There has to be discussion going on for the nomination to be moving forward, I think. And one of the things that I would say about it is that everything at the legislature is transactional. If you think about the fact that you have Democrats who are holding firm here on something that's important to their party and their base for sure. I mean, remember, when the Democrats talk about this, it is under the heading of voting rights, and that is something that Democrats are not going to move on. But the governor does have leverage here. One of the things, and who knows exactly what he's saying to these folks behind closed doors, but the fact that he said on your show that someone other than Whitley is to blame, and he called that person out by name, and again, somebody who the Senate Democrats could not do anything about. But the other thing that the governor's office would probably make clear to various lawmakers, if they're really dug in and they really want this guy to be Secretary of State, the governor, he can send signals that, look, other bills that might be important to some of these Senate Democrats could be vetoed when it's the veto period after they're not in session anymore. And, of course, the lieutenant governor has leverage as well because, the budget process is ongoing, and there are probably things that are in that budget. I know there are things in that budget that are important to various Senate Democrats, various expenditures for their districts, et cetera, or programs that they think are important that could face cuts. So there's always, a tit-for-tat thing that goes on at the legislature. Some call it horse trading, some call it, making the sausage, but it's just the way things work.
Yeah, I'm visiting with Scott Braddock of Quorum Report. If this list had never come out, or if it was real quickly blamed on Texas DPS ahead of time, would Democrats be putting up a fight on the Texas Secretary of State?
No, sir. I mean, there would be no reason to. This whole thing, the way it was rolled out, was really, and we talked about it many times on KFYO, whether you agree with, the idea of trying to do everything you possibly can to secure that voter list, or not, wherever a person is on that, I think even a lot of Republicans have said that the way this was rolled out was kind of just a faceplant by the Secretary of State, and now the DPS being rolled in as well as part of the blame here. There's nothing. I don't see anything that would be objectionable about David Whitley otherwise. And remember,
it seems like everybody likes him.
Yes, and he had only been on the job for a few weeks. The former Secretary of State, Rolando Pablos, had quit the job, resigned the job, sort of abruptly and without a lot of explanation as to why he quit. Although I wouldn't read too much into that because a lot of that is sort of commonplace. The Secretary of State will serve for a while and then move out of the way for the next person. That's something that's gone on in Texas for a long time. Although there are some voting rights activists, some Latino activists who asked this question, because this project of putting this voter list together had been going on for many months, apparently, when Rolando Pablos was the Secretary of State. And then a white guy becomes the new Secretary of State. There are those who have asked, would the Hispanic Secretary of State have carried out this mission? And there are some who answered that by saying no.
Last question on the Texas Secretary of State. Mm-hmm. Is there a timeline? Do they have to vote within a few weeks or just by the end of the session? When does this vote have to occur?
Just by the end of the session. And so, here's another thing that's interesting about that whole horse trading deal is this also gives Senate Democrats some leverage with the governor, right? If there are certain things that they want him to do and that they want leadership to do, for example, maybe make some changes to the property tax legislation, maybe see more money for public schools whenever they finally do get around to having a school finance plan on the table, those sorts of things, they can say to the governor, look, it may be that the DPS director is to blame here, but if you want this, then you're going to have to give us that. Speaking
of other legislation, the Texas Senate expected to vote maybe today for that $5,000 in pay raises for teachers. Yeah. What do you think about this moving forward? How's it looking in the Texas Senate and even in the Texas House?
$4 billion is what they're committing, just about $4 billion, and it goes to $5,000 pay raises for teachers, and this is sort of sailing through the Senate. By the way, Republicans and Democrats alike will say that teachers should be paid more. I don't think you can find a lot of people who would say that teachers should be paid less. And usually the arguments about, how much money gets spent on education, Chad, we've heard it a million times, right? That people will say that not enough money flows directly to the classrooms. People will say that, there's money going to administrators or to, pet projects of school board members or things like that. But this is straight up more money for teachers. If you look at how much is being committed here by the Senate toward the pay increases for teachers, it's a full 44% of what the comptroller said the surplus would be for this budget. Remember, the comptroller, when he put out his original revenue estimate, had said that lawmakers would have about $9 billion additional dollars to spend this year. And so the question becomes, what happens when there's a bad budget year? If the state's going to commit $4 billion right now, by all measures, we have a pretty good budget situation right now. Things are kind of rosy in Austin as far as how much extra money there is to spend. But if you look down the line 2 years from now or 4 years from now, what happens when we have, a tight budget situation, or when we have, when we don't have enough money, when we're in the red, and they start having to make cuts? The question's been asked by a lot of people who are in education and a lot of people who care about the teachers and whether they ought to be able to keep these raises. Are these raises really permanent? And the answer is sort of that they're permanent until they're not. In 2011, the legislature made huge cuts to public education, and there's no reason to think that couldn't happen again if lawmakers get into a situation down the road where the budget will be restricted. And look, that's just the way the economy works. Sometimes you've got, a good year, sometimes you've got a bad year. And so what lawmakers are doing right now, by passing this out of the Senate, and it's not clear that this is exactly the proposal that will end up on Governor Abbott's desk, because the House has its own version of how it wants to do this, or has its own ideas of how they want to do this. And we'll see exactly later this week what the school finance plan is from the Texas House on Tuesday. Actually, tomorrow, the chairman of public education, Dan Huberty from the Houston area, he's going to roll out the details of what he wants to see happen. But look, if they're going to commit future legislatures to a $4 billion expenditure for teacher pay raises, the nightmare scenario for those future lawmakers would be having to cut teacher salaries. The politics of that are just terrible.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to do that.
That probably wouldn't go over too well.
No.
We're visiting with Scott Braddock, editor of Quorum Report. And as you brought up there, the House, I asked Speaker Bonnen about this $5,000 pay raise, and he didn't want to go too much into detail on it, but he did say we're gonna have a different version. We're gonna go about this a different way, that's what it seems to me, is that this is not a done deal, and that this is going to see some changes in the House.
Absolutely. As I understood his comments, he didn't agree with the Senate as far as directing the school districts to spend this money in a specific way. It sounded to me like Bonnen was, and I don't know that he used this term, but I don't think he did, but I think it had more to do with local control, that certain money would flow to the school districts, and then they would be better positioned to figure out exactly how to spend their dollars. Because there are those in education who will say that, even though you do want to pay more to teachers, and nobody disagrees with that again, but there are other positions that do exist in school districts that are important, and sometimes they need to be able to attract top talent for those positions, and so they may need to spend those dollars there. And those kinds of decisions, there are a lot of folks who believe, and it sounds like Speaker Bonnen believes, that the local school boards and superintendents in their areas are better equipped to make those decisions about what's best for their districts.
Yeah. Before I let you go, we're now, it's March 4th. Beto O'Rourke has not officially announced what he's doing. Yeah. He has just said, we've made a decision. It doesn't look like he's going to be running against John Cornyn. Maybe Joaquin Castro's going to run against John Cornyn. What's the shape of all this? How's this shaking out, you think?
I don't know if he's still trying to find himself or what. And, whenever we get into the business of trying to parse every single word of what a certain politician is saying, it can be kind of exhausting, right? O'Rourke had said he would have a decision by the end of last month, which, of course, was just a few days ago. A lot of people read that to mean that the rest of us would get to know what that decision was, but I guess we don't get to know what the decision is just yet. And as you mentioned, with one of the Castro brothers taking a look at running against Senator Cornyn, it could turn into an interesting situation. I mean, these guys, the Castro brothers, have been sort of talked about forever. For years and years about, whether they would run for statewide office in Texas. It's been one of the dreams of Democrats for a long time, but both Castro brothers took a pass on that in 2018. They may have some regrets about that because it turned out to be almost the year for Democrats to break through and win a statewide race in Texas. Of course, that was in an off year, not in a presidential, and who knows what turnout is going to be like in 2020. So one of the Castros potentially, looking at whether he can sort of ride that Democratic enthusiasm in opposition to President Trump to be able to beat Senator Cornyn. And Cornyn taking nothing for granted, as you've seen in his comments. He says, we're going to be ready for whoever it is. And, of course, these Democrats, every time one of them, is talked about as a possible candidate against Cornyn, you'll get an email from Cornyn within 24 hours or a couple of days saying, you may have heard that so-and-so is getting ready to run against me. I could really use your $25.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, maybe Beto's just waiting on the Hickenlooper announcement. Maybe that's what it is.
Still no one knows who Hickenlooper is, but he's number 78 of the Democrats.
Absolutely. Scott, tell folks what they can find on quorumreport.com.
Right now, actually, we have an in-depth Q&A about exactly what these teacher pay raises as proposed mean for teachers and for taxpayers. That's the top thing right now in the Daily Buzz. You can check it out at quorumreport.com. You can also sign up for our free emails there to keep up with what's happening at your Texas Capitol. The free emails only come your way when something actually is happening, not like the political folks who are trying to raise money from you. We're giving you news. Real news, not fake news, at quorumreport.com.
Very good. Scott, as always, good to visit with you, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thanks, Chad. Look forward to it.
Have a good one. That's Scott Braddock. He's the editor of Quorum Report. Follow him on Twitter. That's Scott Braddock on the Chad Hasty Show.